I'm Warren Berkeley with the Laurel Heights Church of Christ, and I'm here with you again for another video, and we are in a study of the epistle Paul wrote to the churches in Galatia. And we're going to continue this time in chapter 1 and verse 13. Please consider this letter to be from God through Paul to the churches in Galatia. Local churches of Christ in Galatia, but there was trouble in that region. There were men in Galatia who were saying something like this: Paul didn't really get it right. We have it right. Paul may not even be a real apostle, but you can listen to us. Well, they were false teachers, and the message they delivered in Galatia was not the gospel. Paul addresses that right here in chapter 1 with uncompromising and stern language. Remember, as we go through Galatians, from God through Paul to Christians in Galatia. Listen now to verses 13 through 24 in chapter 1. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous I was for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. When you first read this, your question might be, what is this all about? Where is Paul headed with this narrative? It may seem abrupt or unconnected with previous context. Let's remember, there were men in Galatia teaching a different message that wasn't the gospel. It is more than a fair assumption. Those false teachers were critical and dismissive of Paul, very likely suggesting he wasn't even a genuine apostle. So Paul begins the letter by asserting that his assignment as an apostle was not from men. In verses 11 and 12, he has said the gospel he preached was not of human origin, but he says he received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now that all connects and leads into this paragraph that starts at verse 13. He traces his movement starting here and into chapter 2. He wants to make it clear. He is not an impostor. He is not a human delegate or anything like that. He is an apostle of Jesus Christ according to the will of God. And this narrative of his movement and his early association is part of the evidence confirming Paul received what he preached from Jesus Christ, not a man or a group of men in Jerusalem or anywhere else. The sequence of movement and contact with people is, he had been a violent persecutor of the church before he obeyed the gospel. Certainly didn't make the gospel up during that time or get it from anyone. In his conversion, Jesus Christ appeared directly to him, gave him the gospel, gave him the charge to preach it. Years after that, he visited the other apostles in Jerusalem. So he's making the case that he didn't get the gospel from men. He was an apostle of Christ, not from men nor through man. Let me say a little more about that. In verse 1, the claim of apostleship. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. Now, when we get to verse 13, Paul is expanding on that claim. He's giving evidence. He's giving enough of his background, his movement, to answer any claims that he was dispatched by a man or a group of men, that his message, therefore, had a human origin. He's reviewing his movement. He's going to talk about people he came in contact with after he had received the gospel. He's going to describe relationships, and this is what we all call transparency. The main point of all this is to provide evidence that he wasn't sent out by men to do the bidding of men, and he didn't get his message from man. He was sent out by Christ after he obeyed the gospel with the gospel of Christ, from Christ. You with me? This is not like emotional testimony to stir an audience. This is supporting evidence that the gospel he preached, he did not get from men. Verse 13, for you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. I don't know what your life was before you were baptized, and very likely you don't know what my life was about before I was baptized. In contrast, many people in the first century knew what Paul was before he became a Christian. He says to the Christians in Galatia, you know this. You have heard this. My former life, Paul says, was a life of violent persecution against the church. We can read about this in the book of Acts. Paul writes about it right here, also mentions it in 1 Timothy. It is important in addressing the issues in Galatia for Paul to remind them of his former life. There was reason to go through this history. It was certainly not in his former life that he and some other men came up with the gospel, nor was it that time when he was a persecutor of the gospel that he came up with it. I'll come back in a moment when I clear my throat from verse 13 into verse 14. More about his former life. Verse 14, I was advancing in Judaism, Paul said, beyond many of my own age, among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my father. Let's take just a moment here for some clarity that will help us not only in our study in Galatians, but in New Testament studies in general. There is an important distinction we need to make between Old Testament law and the religion of Judaism as it was practiced in the first century. See, there was nothing in Old Testament law that suggested or required that Paul persecute anyone. Nothing in the Old Testament justified the violence and persecution Paul had been a part of. Different from the actual Old Testament, there was Judaism. And before Paul's obedience to the gospel, he was a zealous advocate of Judaism. Judaism and the system of the Pharisees claimed Old Testament authority, but actually was a system with a human agenda. The Pharisees created their own system, and their human religious empire was not God's will for the Jews. It wasn't written in the Old Testament. Judaism, in Kaufman's commentary, he says this: Judaism, as it is in the Greek, includes both the divine original as conveyed through Moses and the prophets, but also that incredibly large body of traditions and elaborations of it, which had been added by the religious hierarchy of Israel. The latter coming in time to surpass, in their eyes, the importance of the God-given law itself, making it of no effect. Refer Mark 7:13 and Matthew 15:6. So Paul had been a leading militant in advancing Judaism, not strictly Old Testament law, but Judaism. Paul had become famous and popular, an impressive arrest record and conviction rate against Christians, and the people in Galatia knew this about Paul's former life before he obeyed the gospel. It may seem tedious, but given the climate created by false teachers in Galatia, this was necessary for Paul to go over all this background. False teachers tend to deny the credibility of those who are teaching the truth. They were creating suspicion about Paul. Paul is responding to that for the sake of the Galatians. You have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. So during that time, Paul did not come up with the gospel that he later preached. He was opposed to the gospel that he later preached. Paul had this tarnished past. He admits it. He's transparent. He doesn't conceal it. But it all changed. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. It is an evidence of God's foresight, foreknowledge, and power that before Paul was born, God knew what he would do with this man. There is never any suggestion that God made him into a robot or used him against his will, but God knew before Paul's birth he would call him, and he knew what Paul's answer would be. Let's go over that again for emphasis. God knew before Paul's birth that he would call Paul through the gospel. And God knew what Paul's answer would be. It is not deterministic Calvinism here. It is God's ability to know beforehand what will happen. We believe only God has that kind of knowledge. Let's observe how God did this. Now we're going to talk about how God's purpose was carried out. By His grace, God was pleased to reveal His Son to Paul. God didn't just turn Paul from persecutor to apostle by snapping His divine finger. God had a plan to bring Paul out of sin. That plan was the same for Paul as every other sinner. God was pleased to reveal His Son. Paul was given the choice. Paul made the right choice, and God knew that beforehand, but did not force Paul against his will. Next, God's purpose with Paul was even more specific compared to others. It says that I might preach him among the Gentiles. So God revealed and sent his Son for everybody to be saved who wants to get out of sin. But with Paul, there was a very specific assignment God had in mind to use Paul to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Are you with me? All right, this next phrase is critical. It is the crux of the narrative. I did not immediately consult with anyone. Paul is telling his story, not just for human interest or vanity or entertainment. He's tracing his movement and telling about his conversion in response to the false teacher's efforts to discredit him. Remember, in verse 1, he has said, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ, not from men nor through man. Then in verse 12, I did not receive it from man. So he goes through this to emphasize what he's already claimed. The gospel Paul preached was not man's gospel. He didn't get it from men. It came to him directly through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul is undermining any claim that his gospel message came from a group of men. I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. Now, take the narrative into 18 through 24. What would you do if someone said about you, well, he's not really a Christian. He doesn't stand for the truth. She is not what she claims to be. I think we would answer that. We would go through a similar response. When people misrepresent us, our response is to deny the misrepresentation and tell the truth about who we are. I obeyed the gospel. I heard the gospel. I obeyed it. That's what Paul is doing. And if we respond in that way, we are, of course, not apostles, but we tell people the sequence of events. I heard the gospel. I obeyed the gospel. I'm telling you about the gospel that I didn't get from anybody except the New Testament. Here's the deal. Here's what happened. I didn't get this gospel from a local church somewhere. I got it from the New Testament, though I heard it taught in a local church. And did you notice Paul affirms in verse 20, in what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. Paul's primary interest here is to tell the truth about his obedience to the gospel and his apostleship, and more specifically to make it clear, the gospel he preached, he did not get from any human source. That's our study in Galatians 1, 13 through 24. And I hope we recognize that any effort to deny the gospel we obeyed requires the kind of response Paul gave it. We can say to people, here's what I obeyed to become a Christian. I didn't get this from a group of men here on earth today or from an organization here. I got it from this book. That's the message we need to convey to people. We need to tell people we're living under the light of God's presence through the authority of Christ as written in the New Testament. Thank you for listening.